I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist,
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
and this is When East
Meets West. Pete, we're talking about one of my favorite things to talk about, which is maybe going to surprise some people today, which is intuition. Hi.
Why is that going to surprise people?
Oh, well, because I think, I don't think when people think of cognitive behavioral therapy, I don't think intuition comes to mind as a common concept or like
Notice
discussion
your
point.
judgment, Dr. Rubin.
Yeah. Well, but I don't know if it's a judgment. I just think that that's sort of, I think maybe some people would be surprised to hear like a clinical psychologist say, yes, we're going to talk about intuition, and this is like a really important thing to discuss and connect with and practice.
It's something that's relevant in all that I do, both as a professor, because and working with athletes. It's a thing you can't teach. You can teach how to connect with it.
That's what it is. You can teach how to access it, but you can't give someone intuition. We all have it, though. That's
right.
The thing.
Well, does everybody have it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe we could start. Well, I would love to start maybe, as I know you and I both geek out on this. Maybe we could start by like the talking about like neurons in the gut, right? About the biology around it.
Should I give you a definition first?
I'm going to say yes.
The ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning.
Yeah. Yep.
I
dig. Yeah, I dig that.
I went to Oxford this time.
Okay. Yeah. That's fair. That's mixing it up. Okay. Yeah. Well, so, because to this point, it's like some people might ask themselves, like, maybe I don't have intuition. Yeah. Maybe I don't have an intuitive sense. And, the answer is yes, you do. It's like, how do we access it? So maybe we could start by talking about just this part of our body. And for listeners that aren't familiar about this blew my mind when I first learned this. Yeah. In the GI tract, in our gastrointestinal system, it's the only other place in the human body where neurons exist, the same cells that are in the brain. Did this blow your mind when you learned this? Like, were you like,
yeah. Well, I say that with clients because I learned that the most concentrated neurons are in that area.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, and so, when I first read this, I was like, holy hell. I mean, this is kind of amazing, right? So so can you say a little bit more about, what you learned about it and sort of what you express when you're in therapy, when you're teaching people about it?
So I grab my stomach. Yeah. Well, I usually, if I quiz and I'll say like, so where do you think the most neurons?
You mean for listeners, so you use some Socratic questioning as a good CBT therapist. That's right. A good,
Some Socratic questioning to where do you think the most concentrated neurons are in your body? And oftentimes people think, what do you think, Nikki?
They think, I'd go brain.
The brain.
Right.
And so I say, nope.
You just booyah them. Yeah.
Booyah. Yep. Yeah. Insert emoji with the brain blowing.
Yes.
It's the gut. It's that and there's a name for that, the enteric nervous system, which I didn't learn that in grad school.
Well, I don't think that it was actually like as common knowledge, honestly.
Really?
Like
we're not that old. Like you say,
we're not. We did graduate 10 years. We graduated 10 years ago. I mean, that's what no, exactly.
Oh, it is the 10th anniversary. That's right.
2011.
So this will be our 10-year friend anniversary.
No, it's our 11-year friend anniversary because our internship's the last. I stick to this stuff. But 10 years since we earned our doctoral degrees, right?
So okay, but it wasn't long ago. I didn't.
But this wasn't talked about as much. This was this is kind of a new thing in psychology research to be talking about. I mean,
that's a shame.
It's like this is where like different wings of science, sometimes they're kind of doing their own things, I think, and then eventually converge. I think it's yes, this is.
So we're playing nice in the sandbox.
No, I think we're playing in the sandbox. It's more like parallel play. We don't know what the biologists are doing over there.
You got to play in the sandbox to be able to know what the biologists are doing. Like if that sandbox is for biologists, that one's for neurologists, that one's for psychiatrists.
We're all in the
body together.
Yeah, because we're all the body, right?
Okay, thank you. That's what I'm getting at. So that's what we learn. That's what we teach. And so I'll ask clients about that. They usually feel like really interested in it because everybody has had a gut feeling. So and I think sometimes they feel that the gut feeling, like when you walk into a dark room, what's that psychological phenomenon where like you think something bad's going to happen. And then, but you remember it, like you always are thinking bad things are going to happen, but the time it happens, then you think it's exactly what you were thinking was going to happen. Oh my God, that was just 20 minutes.
I would just say, I just call that anxiety, and then anxiety, right? Because to that point, so, and this is where people can get confused, and maybe we could kind of parse this apart a little bit for our listeners, is that a lot of people confuse a gut feeling, their intuition, with emotions, and they're not the same. So a lot of times people say, my gut's telling me something bad's going to happen. I'm like, that's not your gut talking. That's your gut's not an oracle. Your gut doesn't predict what's going to happen. Your gut is reading information in this moment. The neurons, and so I'll say to people, why did evolution select for neurons in the gut, right? And from some of the things I've read, some of like the hypotheses, it's like, well, like it's a long way to travel up the spinal column to bring the information to the brain, right? So it's something, and this is where mindfulness comes in, that it's something that's happening in this moment, and your body is taking in the data that's available. And it's very adaptive to try to read that without having to go through all the processing that our brains do. I mean, we talk a lot about how that processing our brains do is often not very useful, right?
You're so mad at the brain.
So funny. It's something that's really tickled me when you say that, because I think it's like I really actually like love brains so much.
I know you do. That's what's so funny.
Yeah, it's actually that I'm so mad at I'm so mad at our species for not compassionately understanding how brains actually work. That's really what it is, because I'm like, brains are so awesome. They're just like, they're limited. You know what I mean? They're not God, they're.
So there's a cognitive science to the way that we're processing that. Like, so what I hear you saying is like, that's the cognitive science of how we process the information, because that gut or that enteric nervous system doesn't have to go up to the brain. It's kind of like when you put your hand on a hot stove, you learn this in biology. It doesn't have to go to the brain to say, oh, get that off.
Right. It's just like, do this.
Off.
Right. Yes.
And that's what I'm saying about like the dark room analogy I was trying to give, which you're right. Maybe it's anxiety, but there is also like a social psychology phenomena of like, for example, listeners have known someone who said, oh, I had the feeling I was going to get in an accident that morning, and I got in an accident.
Oh, okay. So this is what it is. This is also important to distinguish. I've talked about this recently with somebody. That's a premonition. And I tell people, I'm like, a premonition and intuition are not the same thing.
No.
And so in psychology, we don't, unfortunately, there's not a lot of study around premonitions. And this is going to, there can be like really hardcore scientists are going to say there's no evidence for that. I will share, I show this to patients. I've had premonitions before, and I think, and some people have them, some people don't. But I recognize that's not intuition. A premonition, again, I don't know why I've had them or what that means, whatever. I don't understand how most things work in the universe.
Sure.
But that's not my gut. Right. Intuition is happening in this moment. Right. Intuition is just with data that's available. And intuition is really powerful because it's telling us something that sometimes we don't want to listen to. Right. Yeah. Like sometimes it's because, again, our cognitive brains get in the way and they tell us stories about like, oh, like let's say you walk into a dark room and your intuition is like, something feels off in here.
Yeah.
That's different than something bad's going to happen. Right.
Yeah.
And I try to get people to, and from a behaviorist standpoint, tune into listening. Listening's a behavior, right?
Well, how did you get to that?
To this process of
how did you get to a place where you have a relationship with intuition?
With my intuition? That's a great question. I would say it's interesting. I mean, I think that it's almost like I had to relearn how to have a relationship with it. I think that
or unlearn.
Well, I would argue we can't unlearn things, right? Like it's always, I can learn to not reinforce some unhelpful learning. But I think that when I was younger, I was more connected to it. And then being a really, verbal, chatty, problem solving psychologist, I think sometimes that took me away from that. Right? Me? Yeah.
You mean you cornering me inside of a conference room as we're trying to leave? And I was like, I got to just get out. But Nikki had to tell me this story.
I did. I really did. Pete always references that story as like a hard data point of how my brain, 410.
So this 6'3" man is trying to leave a conference room at 4:10. California girl was like, I gotta tell you the story.
He was like, honey, we gotta salute,
So you had to
yes.
relearn.
I had to relearn how to her yes on to the side in a really compassionate way, and then tune into listening. And I think for me, the way that I've learned to access that is, shocker of the year, not the sarcasm here, through mindfulness, mindfulness, and that, and honestly, like I also came to it as I have personally, my other mindfulness practices through cognitive behavioral therapies, because in dialectical behavior therapy and DBT, intuition is referred to as wise mind.
Yeah.
And so, listeners, you're welcome to Google emotion mind, reasonable mind, and wise mind, which is a Venn diagram.
I used that in session today.
It's such a great thing. And
that never gets old.
Well, it doesn't, because I tell people, I'm like, look, this is just, DBT being a part of the CBT family, this is just what CBT calls it. I said, this concept is found in every culture, every spiritual tradition, right? It's because, and again, in biology, like this is a part of our body.
Yeah.
Right. It's a part of our body that we want to listen to, but we have to make space to listen to it.
So we're calling it the enteric nervous system. It's also the second brain, which is important for listeners to recognize.
There's a book called The Second Brain.
There's a book called The Second Brain. And it really taps into creativity. I don't know if you think about that, but that intuition, the gut, the second brain really allows us to access, like you said, things that you wouldn't have otherwise accessed. And I think part of that is creativity, which we talk a lot about here. Curiosity, creativity, that's all part of that whole mindfulness journey.
Absolutely. And I think, it's really just, it's listening to our own inner wisdom, right? It's that voice that we all have inside of ourselves. And I think, what's important to clarify here, especially if we're trying to clarify the difference between premonition or anxiety, which is saying something bad's going to happen, right? Intuition, I always say, is not chatty. It's like very still. It's very matter of fact. Sometimes it says, I don't know. Like sometimes people will be like, well, what my gut's telling me, I need, that I have to do this thing. And I'm like, I don't know. That doesn't sound like your gut to me. It sounds kind of intense. Like, is your gut saying that? Or is your gut saying, maybe I don't have enough information yet? Maybe I don't know.
And gather more information.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Sometimes intuition is really loud and we don't want to listen to it. Like, I feel like a common example would be like someone's in a relationship that on the outside, like checks all the boxes and maybe it's a really wonderful person, but something intuitively, something in someone's gut is saying it's not right. And they don't want to listen to that. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Because we want to fall in love with what might be or what could be. And I think gathering data for many of us is hard, especially like when you live in a very impulsive culture.
Yeah.
Our culture is really impulsive.
Oh yeah. I mean, we're instant gratification. So we say that a lot on this podcast that in the United States, like that's a very, it's like a very American kind of thing. Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Pete, I'm wondering for you then, I mean, I guess I'll ask you the same question. What is your relationship with your intuition, or how did you come to learn to connect with it?
Well, I'm still learning because it's a process. It's a lifelong process. It's a journey. And I definitely mindfulness and meditation. In Zen, we find that intuition is this state between the universal mind and one's individual discriminating mind, which is exactly like we're saying with wise mind.
Yes, it's like between emotion mind and reasonable mind. It's the same thing.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, because we know Marshall Linehan, the developer of dialectical behavioral therapy, studied Buddhism.
Zen Buddhism.
That's right. And that's how she developed this. And that's exactly where that comes from. And that's why I use the word unlearn. I know that your behaviorism came in and said no such thing.
Right.
And then I said, well, that's part of what we do in Zen. And I mentioned on here before the koans. And so as we're trying to like learn about teachings, it's really about unlearning preconceptions we have about belief systems, because that's what interferes with intuition ultimately.
That's right. There's actually, and I want to make sure I mention this on this episode because I think it's such a wonderful example. There is, have you read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell? Have you ever read that book?
No.
Okay. Highly recommend it. And for any listeners, it's highly recommend it. Blink is basically a book about this. That's not, if you read the back of the book, it doesn't say like Malcolm Gladwell is talking about intuition, but the whole book is about, and he's a great writer and a very thorough researcher when he's doing a topic. And basically the book is about, I would say, kind of like about decision making, and blink being like, we make our most effective decisions in these, and again, he doesn't use this word so much, but these intuitive, mindfulness-based, moment-based ways. And what research has found is that ineffective decisions are made when people make impulsive, emotion-based decisions.
That's right.
And when they overthink, they go too much into the thinking mind. And so I've had so many patients over the years come to me like separately and say like, have you ever read Blink? Like this Blink is like about intuition. And I'm like, I know, it's exactly that. So and again, if we bring in, a behavioral lens, like really conceptualizing this as a behavior you can practice accessing and listening to your intuition, right? And I actually also tell people, like, the way I like to teach access to it and how I practice it myself is I like to start by actually locating that physical place in the body, right? So I'll say to people like, practice by using, in yoga, a lot of times we talk about like the mind's eye, which is basically like if a listener right now closed their eyes and I said, can you locate your left earlobe using your mind's eye? Most people are like, yeah. Can you find your right kneecap? Can you find the top of your head? Okay, now find the physical center of your body. And I say that, I'm like, and I'll go like very literally, like wherever your physical center is. A lot of people, it's somewhere like behind the belly button, right? Or just below that. And then I'll say, and just focus attention on that place.
Right there.
Just right there. And it's so interesting because, again, I've done this with tons and tons of people. What do people say when they're focusing their attention? They'll say, oh, I feel very still. I feel solid. I feel peace, right? And I'll say, okay, so now we know you're connecting with your gut, your intuition. Practicing that, right? That's a place. And then I'll say, and then with time, you can start to listen to what it has to say.
Which is hard for people. And that takes practice. And
it does.
One thing I thought that I keep having is like, whatever decision you're about to make is not your last. And I think that that's part of the overthinking piece of intuition.
Yes.
Is that we feel like this next decision is so big that I need to have all of reasonable mind, all of emotional mind, and try and find my gut at the same time, because this is such a big decision, versus like, what if you just let that go, try not to overthink and mindfully connect that center piece and then see what comes up.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I think that is one, very eloquently said, and two, extremely important, because that comes back to this misunderstanding that like intuition's like some people think it's going to tell you what's going to happen. And it's not. It's about making decision in this moment, right? What with the information available, and decision making, I was just like, it's risk taking. You're like, okay, and let's see what happens. Like, I'll share the example that I always actually share with patients when talking about this with Pete, and this Pete's part of the story, because it has to do with where I ended up for internship, which is for me deciding to match at the place that Pete and I were interns at together was an intuition-based decision. Like at the time, I really wanted to move to New York, and for a lot of reasons, I knew it was going to be harder to match there, given my training and coming from California, and so it was absolutely an intuitive decision, like with the information I had available. And when I got there, it turned out to be one of the hardest years of my life, right? It turned out to be and I always tell patients, that doesn't mean my intuition was wrong.
Right.
And I didn't regret the decision, right? I was like, it was absolutely the right decision for me. Just because it was hard, it didn't undo what my gut had been telling me. It was just my gut didn't know what was next.
Well, and that hard doesn't mean wrong.
Correct.
And that's the other piece of that. Wait, so can you use your intuition to tell me the lottery numbers for next week?
Well, see, that's what I'm saying. Intuition is not and as I say over and over again to people, I'm like, your gut's not an oracle, right? Your gut is not an oracle.
There's a movie about that though, isn't there?
Well, The Matrix. There's an oracle and there's an oracle in the Matrix. So Pete, thank you for sharing about how you teach intuition and your practices with it, and I just want to leave listeners with this concept that you have a gut, right? You have neurons in there. And because of that, you have intuition that is always available to you to connect with and listen to. And if you slow down and begin to practice connecting with it, you can listen to what it has to say. This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin.
And I'm Dr. Pete Economo. Be present, be brave. This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.